All right, I'm sure more people will continue to roll in, but we will get started. I love the excitement or community side that's going on in the chat, so thank you. My name is Jesse Hayman. I'm the Chief Growth Officer for Greenspace Health, and I am excited to be your host for today and honored to be joined by the Yale Measurement-Based Care Collaborative that's currently sharing the screen with me. As many of you know, we've had 135 people that registered for today attend a past session. We started this educational partnership in the hopes that we could raise awareness and education around the potential impact for measurement-based care. And I can speak on behalf of both Greenspace and the Yale Collaborative when I say that we both have a very strong belief in the impact that measurement-based care can make when implemented widespread across the behavioral health space, and what that would do to the quality of services across North America. And I've used the term before, flipping the script, or the sentence, I guess, before flipping the script, which really what I mean when I say that is traditionally measurement has really been a reporting exercise, not done often enough or in a way that provides clinical value. And what measurement-based care can do is flip the script to making measurement first and foremost about clinical value and making sure that it is that the active measurement is empowering clinicians, clinics, clinical leaders, and people in care with the tools and information they need in order to thrive and improve outcomes of treatment. There is a ton of growing momentum for measurement-based care. We can see that through the over 1,200 people that have registered for all three of these sessions, for the people that are continuing to come back. You can see it through the Joint Commission, really getting behind measurement-based care and encouraging its adoption. State regulators and payers starting to talk about, and in some cases, require measurement-based care. And then clinics across North America that are choosing to implement measurement-based care, either to improve their services, better understand their strengths and areas to improve, or in some cases, to better advocate for the care that they offer, whether that's just generally or in value-based care payment models. As momentum continues to rise, and I've covered this before, there is always, with a change of this nature, people that are going to be super excited and be early adopters. There's going to be people that are excited and have a lot of questions, and there's going to be people that are not happy about it or not excited. And that is just essentially a rule of law when it comes to any big change. And I think what's important is that we provide opportunity for education to answer those questions and make people feel comfortable. That is exactly what we're trying to do here. And based on the panel surveys, most of the people in attendance, I think, fall into that first and second group, which is early adopters. 70% of all people that have responded to the survey, which is a couple hundred people at the end of the last panels, has said that they're considering implementing measurement-based care within the next 12 months. 65% of those have said that they're considering implementing measurement-based care immediately. Those are the exact people we're looking to help with these sort of sessions and with each of these panels. There are questions that have come up throughout first of all, the first two panels that we haven't had a chance to answer, many of which we have. So we're going to start this panel really focusing on the questions that haven't been answered that has come up to make sure that we get to them. They are similar questions to ones that come up, whether we're working with a small agency out of California that's working on implementation, or a large organization like Meraki that has obviously very different issues, but it's similar questions that come up across the board. And so hopefully today we'll be able to provide some clarity around those questions and help you set up to make decisions around measurement-based care, whether that's whether to implement or not, or in your implementation process, be able to help you with some guidance and suggestions through the voices of the Yale Measurement-Based Care Collaborative. With all that said, there's a couple quick housekeeping things I just wanted to get to. One is that a new function we're using today is polls. So there may be a poll that popped up on your screen. Encourage you to participate, choose the question or the answer that makes sense for you. We've also scheduled time at the end, more than we have in the past, to answer your questions. Those will come from questions that have been submitted in advance from the people in attendance, but they'll also come from live questions that you submit now. Please don't put them in the chat. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you click that Q&A button, you can submit a question. Even if you're not submitting a question, there's a little thumbs up there at the bottom. That's essentially an upvoting feature. So we're going to choose the questions that we take at the end based on the amount of upvotes that are for them to make sure we're answering the ones that most people in attendance want us to answer. So please jump in there, give a thumbs up if you'd like a question answered so that we can make sure we get to it. Two more things on the housekeeping side. There'll be a survey at the end like there has on the other panels. Please fill it out. It helps inform us on what topics you're looking to address so that we can inform any future sessions we have, whether that's with Yale or with other clinicians or clinical leaders. And the last thing is there's a button that says closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. We have that turned on so you can see closed captions if you'd like, but we can't make it automatic. So if you want the closed captions, just press that button and they'll pop up on your screen. With that said, I have the absolute pleasure to introduce my friends and colleagues at the Yale Measurement-Based Care Collaborative and your panelists for today, Dr. Amber Childs, Dr. Jessica Barber, Dr. Sandy Resnick, and Dr. Elizabeth Connors. I will pass it to each of you to introduce yourselves, and that's where we'll start. And maybe I'll kick it to Sandy to start.
Thanks, Jesse, and hi, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to be here. So I'm Sandy Resnick, and I, like my colleagues, am a clinical psychologist. I have a background in psychiatric rehabilitation, and I lead large-scale implementation efforts of measurement-based care.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're so excited to see many of you rejoining us, and to those new faces, so excited to meet you all as well. I'm Amber Childs. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm really invested in sort of being the hype team of measurement-based care, but have also really gotten my hands around some of the problem solving and strategy around creative implementation in a variety of settings within our health system here at Yale. So excited to be a part of this conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Connors. I'm an assistant professor in the Yale School of Medicine. My training is as a child clinical community psychologist, and my MBC work really focuses on partnering with schools and community mental health clinics that serve children, adolescents, and their families. I'm really interested in helping teams figure out how to successfully implement MBC. I just want to underscore what my colleague said about our enthusiasm about being here, and also our gratitude to Greenspace for hosting these educational panels and making this possible. There really just isn't enough general information in the field right now about how to do MBC, so it's just really a pleasure to be a part of this process. Jessica.
I second everything my colleagues have said about being so glad to be here and so glad all of you have joined us. I'm Jessica Barber. I too am a clinical psychologist. My specialization is in clinical health psychology. I'm an assistant clinical professor at the Yale School of Medicine. I'm a clinician who uses measurement-based care, and I have the pleasure of getting to work with Dr. Resnick in large-scale implementation of measurement-based care.
Awesome. Thank you all very much. Before we get into the questions, we're going to start with one of the polls I mentioned, which just is understanding the familiarity of the audience and attendees in regards to measurement-based care. So that should be on your screen now. Take a second to fill that out, and then we'll get going. I can do a little Jeopardy in the background if that helps. Okay, so results are still coming in. I'll give it 10 more seconds, and then I'll pop up because it looks like almost all of you have responded. Okay, so you should be able to see the results on your screen now, which is a real mix, which is great. I thought we might have some people, well, I didn't think it'd be that much of an even split, but that's great. Good thing for our session generally. I think we're starting pretty high level and also getting into some details around measurement-based care overall. And then there's also, for those that haven't attended in the past, for the ones that might not be very familiar and may not have been on prior sessions, we'll be sharing past educational content we have from other sessions, which you can dive into after the fact. But we want to start with talking about the definition of measurement-based care. For the new people online and as a refresher for those in the group, can you, Jessica, please describe measurement-based care overall and just generally how it differs from traditional measurement?
Sure. So measurement-based care essentially is the use of patient-reported outcome measures to help to monitor how treatment is going. And it's used as a regular and routine part of care, and it allows us to think about treatment adjustments. I think the best way to highlight the differences between measurement-based care and routine assessment is through the model that we utilize, which is called Collect, Share, Act. So collect is where we collect those measures regularly and repeatedly with multiple mid-treatment measures. And the idea is we want to do this frequently enough so that we can use the data collaboratively with the client to adjust care in this episode of care. And we also want to make sure that we're engaging the client from the beginning by talking about the rationale for measurement-based care, how we're going to use the measures, how we're going to incorporate it into our treatment. And then we do share. So share is where we actively use the data, where we talk about it with the client. We use it to explore the context of what the client is experiencing. To me, it's like asking, how are you doing? But using the data and the measures to help guide that conversation. So ensuring the client knows what the scores mean, that it resonates with them, that they agree with what the information is suggesting, and then exploring that, really getting curious, as my colleagues like to say. And we also want to share that data with our colleagues in the record as appropriate for our settings, and so that we have it for ourselves, because we are going to want to refer back to that data for ACT. And ACT is where we really sort of back up and look at the treatment trajectory. How is this person doing over time? And to me, this is where we're sort of asking, how are we doing together at helping you reach your goals? So we look to see if there's improvement, worsening, no change. And we ask the question of, if we're not seeing the progress we were hoping for, should we do something different? Should we make some kind of adjustment and have a collaborative conversation, incorporating all of the data, including the measure data, with the client in figuring out what those next steps might look like. So in that way, we have a shared language, a very collaborative process that enhances therapeutic alliance and partnering.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jessica. That was super helpful. There's a question that's come up a couple of times in our last sessions, and we haven't had a chance to tackle it. And so wanted to very much get to this one early. From your experience, and I'm going to throw this at Elizabeth, and based on the research that's out there, are there population types where we see the greatest positive impact of measurement-based care versus others?
Oh, that's a great question, Jesse. Thanks. So I think just first of all, in terms of the big picture, measurement-based care has been shown to have a positive effect on treatment outcomes for a wide variety of different treatment modalities and service settings and client characteristics. And I'm sure of people that are actually on the panel today, you probably represent a really wide range of all kinds of different specialties that you have, different ways that your services are delivered. The clients that you're working with are all really different. So that's something really special and unique and exciting about MBC for us. But you might be wondering, like, why, how is that? And it's because, the secret sauce, so to speak, of MBC on outcomes for such a wide array of clients and settings is that you can add it to any treatment plan to improve your understanding of the client and really engage them, partner with them as active participants in their care. And we know that that is going to positively affect the treatment outcomes. So a lot of times MBC is referred to as trans-theoretical and trans-diagnostic. I do want to throw a couple caveats in there, though. There are a few exceptions. We don't have data yet on all the possible populations. So for example, like psychotic disorders, we're still gathering some research evidence on that. Some treatment modalities we're still learning more about, like psych rehab, and what about MBC in schools. And at least one study so far has raised some questions about MBC effectiveness for clients with personality disorders. So we always like to make sure we're kind of like bringing those caveats to you all and speaking some balance and truth. But to your question, Jesse, kind of back to your original question, we also see in some of the larger meta-analyses that MBC appears to especially benefit clients who are on average not doing as well as we would have expected based on their demographics and diagnoses. So we are seeing this pattern showing up where MBC is having an outsized effect, like the size of the effect sizes are larger for those who are not responding to care, as well as research shows that they should be.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm curious, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in there with you. Do you have any thoughts on why the effect might be outsized in those that aren't doing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the main topic that we talk about here and kind of how we can understand these results is that as clinicians, we really want to see people at their best. We're pulling for them to make gains in therapy with us. We're rooting for them and we want things to be good. But when things are not going as expected in an episode of care, you can add this little measurement routine with MBC and it really augments our clinical judgment. It can give us some attunement to make proactive adjustments in the treatment plan that otherwise otherwise we might have missed if we were just doing our treatment plan without MBC as a part of that process. And in fact, the MBC research really talks about this. So MBC is providing what's called an early signal alarm when somebody is not progressing as expected. So essentially, MBC provides an alert, an early alert to us to adjust our treatment approach a little earlier and more proactively than we might have realized on our own. I also think related to this, when MBC is done correctly, the client is encouraged and empowered to speak up and say when their care is not working for them, and what they might like to see go differently in those interactions and, you know, in their therapy process. And so they're actually part of that proactive treatment adjustment decision as well.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I may have mentioned this on a past panel, but I think it's worth mentioning in this case. It's less data focused and much more subjective, but one of our clinical leaders for a clinic that we work with in Ontario is also someone who went through their own addiction recovery and used measurement-based care in that process. And she speaks really well to the impact that, first of all, measurement-based care had on her. One, the connection with her clinician and the ability to see trends in her data that helped inform their treatment. But the second piece was the impact that measurement-based care had on her, because it was such a long, like a lengthy, difficult process that has its ups and downs, that she spoke to measurement-based care as providing her hope in days or weeks where she was feeling really poor and feeling like she hadn't made much change or advancement or progression. And by looking at the data, she could get a quantitative and objective measure to see how she was doing and see that she was still making progress. And so now in her clinical work as a clinical director, they use measurement-based care in the traditional ways to help clients and clinicians connect and better align on care. But the other side is they call it as an empowerment tool for those going through addiction recovery to better understand their own care and find that hope when they need it. So just an interesting, I think, example of the way it can work to help people that are maybe not responding to certain treatments. So with that, I'm gonna pass it to Amber. And one of the questions that come up is people sometimes have difficulty understanding how they should approach choosing assessment. So I'm just curious if you could provide some thoughts on which assessment should be used and what should be kept in mind in the process of making that decision.
This is such a great question, and it's a really complex question. So I'm going to answer it from the perspective of trying to provide a framework for how people can think, as opposed to some specific measures that people might choose, which may frustrate folks, but I think it gives you more to go on than us sort of just sharing what measures are. So the first thing that I always like to really lift up in this space is that people are multifaceted, right? They are experiencing challenges that are at the intersection of a number of different domains. And so I want to just really honor that, because oftentimes we will hear, you know, gosh, how do we choose what specifically to measure with an individual? And I have found that different stakeholder groups are going to have different thought processes around measurement selection related to that specific question. So administrators and organizations, you've heard here that many of our colleagues work in large-scale measurement-based care implementation. There's some opportunities for systems, if they're really thinking about organizational goals and objectives, to move toward a perhaps more restricted or defined consensus-driven measurement set. And what I mean by that is really, you know, if we want to think about the phenomenon of depression, for example, it might behoove us to have one measure perhaps of depression for adults, and then one measure of depression for youth, as opposed to 10 different measures of depression running around. So that's what I really mean by measurement consensus. That can be more viable from an IT perspective, from a clinical workflow perspective, and it might help to support some of those aggregate data analysis objectives, particularly if they're linked, as Jesse, as you mentioned, to accreditation standards at the top. So folks want to be able to compare apples to apples, if you will. Now, clinicians and providers perhaps might, again, really wanting to honor the complexity of individuals, might want to lean into more expansive measurement sets, where it's like, you get a measure, you get a measure, you get a measure, you get a measure. And while that can be really helpful in terms of individualizing and tailoring things, it can also present challenges when we come to meet some of those organizational goals. So the reality is that there's no one solid set answer about what measures you should choose or how you should choose them. But we have found within our health system that it's like balancing a seesaw. It's like a combination of those two approaches of having some consensus measurement sets, as well as then some supplemental measures that can be drawn upon. So here at Yale New Haven Health System, what we really try to do is reconnect with what the core principles are of what makes a good measure. Now, many of you on this call might yourselves be administrators, decision makers, and sort of have an organizational viewpoint that you're coming at, but then also some of you may be clinicians and providers. The slide that you're seeing here is a really useful framework. So I'm not going to hold you, I'm not going to keep you for too long, but what this does show is that while there are many things that are worth measuring for us to honor people's complexity, they don't all have to be measured for MBC to be effective. And these bullets that you see here are really guideposts for us within our own thinking about those specific measures that we're going to choose. So none of these things are embroidered on any pillows anywhere, but what we find is that, we want to have the measure be self-reported by the person. We want the measure to be supported by research and have strong psychometric properties. Generally speaking, it's important that we be able to benchmark in some way what the person who we're serving is saying against perhaps what other people with a similar issue might be saying or in a similar population. We want the measure to be, there's some other things here that you see relevant to treatment, right? So while there are many things that are happening for people, what are the things that we're specifically going to be working on in treatment? And let's think those through. We don't want to keep you for 55 items. So we want to keep it short, tight, and sweet. We want it to be sensitive to change depending on how often we're treating the person, et cetera. And so you'll see here just a number of things to really consider as you make that measurement selection. Moving away from those guideposts a little bit and kind of just touching upon the measurement consensus and then sort of supplemental measurement strategy that we have found really effective at Yale New Haven Health System, we have identified sort of core domains that we measure within each of our populations. So anxiety, depression, substance use, trauma symptoms. These are sort of core issues that people may come forward with. And so what we've worked to do within our system is bring clinicians, providers, administrators, decision makers to the table and say, these are the domains. What are the measures that we can choose that meet those principles that can be utilized so that we're able to compare more apples to apples across clinics and programs. And then there are going to be things beyond depression that people want to understand. And so we have what are called a supplemental set of measures that we also use. We still do use a little bit of consensus around that because we don't want 10 different measures for quality of life, for example, to be running around. But that is a little bit of how we frame the balance between selecting the measures.
Thank you for that response, Amber. Super fulsome and I think helpful generally. We can also share that slide with people after the fact. I think when you say supplemental measures, what stands out to me a little bit is just like the ability for clinicians to customize in care. And I think sometimes what people think of when measurement-based care comes in is, hey, here are these, let's use an example. You have a clinic that runs 3 specific assessments across their entire clinic, or maybe they split it up with 2 or 3 assessments per program type. And there happens to be an eating disorder program where a clinician has someone who is struggling significantly with social anxiety or social functioning. So that clinician may want to add a work and social adjustment scale for that person because it aligns with their treatment goals and that their specific issues, but may not make sense across the entire program. And so in that case, that clinician and that client now can dive into something that is very specific to them, but is maybe not something that needs to be tracked across the top. And we've just found that on Greenspace, as an example, you have 50 plus assessments, you add on an assessment for each specific client, but it doesn't affect your overall set where you're benchmarking across a clinic or across a program. So thank you for that. The next thing we're going to jump into is measurement frequency, which is also a question that has come up a couple of times. And so before we get into it, I'm going to use that poll function again. So it's going to pop up on your screen now, just to see what people's thoughts are on how often measures should be sent to people in care. As the poll is going, I just saw there's a couple questions that have gone into the chat. If you do have a question, please throw them in the Q&A, and that way everyone else also can upvote on it, so we make sure we're catching the ones that are most popular. We'll give it a few more seconds for people to respond. Most of you have responded, 70+%. Okay, I will stop it there and share the results. So just looking at this quickly with you all, 40% is the most prevalent one, showing at once a month. And then past that, you have every week. And then there isn't an ideal frequency, but more is better. So a little bit across the board, but leaning towards more often, it seems, which is great. What's interesting in this is when we talk about measurement as a reporting exercise versus measurement versus clinical value, what we often see when measurement is required is every 6 months or every year, which is a difficult one in regards to actually understanding what has led to that change and being able to dive into it. So I think, Elizabeth, I'm going to throw this to you and you'll probably talk more about that, but just curious if you could share with the group your thoughts on frequency and generally what people should be thinking about when choosing measurement frequency.
Yeah, I love this question. I'm so glad we did the poll because I think this is an area of measurement-based care where we're all as a field trying to get really curious together about what is going to benefit our clients the most, and really going beyond, as you said, Jesse, just those maybe agency or higher order requirements, because the spirit of MBC is really in trying to figure out what is going to provide the most clinical value for you and the client or clients in front of you. We don't know yet really the ideal frequency for administering measures, but we're pretty sure that more is better to detect change, especially in the beginning of care. So for those of you who voted more is better, that's pretty aligned with our read of the literature and our experiences. We know, for example, Len Bickman and some of his colleagues showed that in youth treatment, outcomes were better with weekly administration of measures when compared to every 90 days, and showing this dose-based effect of better outcomes for providers who were actually doing measures more frequently. And we've actually seen evidence of that dose effect in the child and adolescent literature as well, as some of our own MBC implementation efforts, because we're always evaluating and looking at our own evaluation data when we're taking on a new MBC effort. So there is a dose effect there, in that the more often you're collecting measures, it's likely going to be significantly associated with those better outcomes. But the truth is, we really still don't know yet. And this is in part because it's probably very context dependent. How often you see the client, what your model of care is, and perhaps most importantly, what's acceptable to them and acceptable to you in terms of what feels right.
And if it's okay, I'm just going to jump in and add to this, because as I mentioned early on, my background's in psych rehab. So things like supported employment, assertive community treatment, and those often have very long lengths of stay, and change sometimes can take a while. And so, initially as a clinician, I did measures every session when I did psychotherapy, and had a hard time getting my head around what this might look like in some of these other treatment settings with individuals who may have more chronic and more intense service needs. And so again, we don't have answers just to raise the question and the framework. I liked how Amber had put this, is like, we can't always answer your questions directly because the research isn't there yet, but we can give you a framework to think about it. Mm-hmm. And one point is more generally does seem to be better, but that you want to be targeting what you're treating, and that change is that the rate of change can also help you determine how frequent. So maybe in some of these longer term settings, you start with monthly, especially early on as you're getting to know somebody, and it is possible that you could go to lengthier intervals afterward, but we're still trying to figure that out.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Sandy. A lot of measures will have a recommended frequency that the authors put on there. So with Greenspace, we generally default to the suggested frequency, but then clinics and clinicians, based on the program that they're in, the length of the program, can make that change or edit it accordingly, including according to what your client wants. So maybe that actually you have a client that is really engaged in measurement-based care and is excited about seeing their data, but it's only happening monthly. They'd like to look at it more often. Well, in that one specific case, you may change that to every 2 weeks or even every week, because it's going to help that person engage in care, and that they're suggesting that they're getting value from looking at the results and really thinking through them and getting curious about them with their clinician. In the past panels, we've spoken about the Collect, Share, Act model of measurement-based care, and Jessica, you took us through a bit of an overview of it as well. I'm going to throw this back to Elizabeth, but I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit to how measurement-based care has been shown to impact therapeutic alliance, as well as clients' experience during therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this topic. And as I was talking earlier about like, what's that secret sauce? You know, why do we think MBC has such an impact on client outcomes? The research indicates that the therapeutic relationship and alliance and that experience in care that MBC creates is that mechanism of change. And so there's a lot of us actually trying to advance the research right now and really detecting those mechanisms of action. But there are studies have already shown, especially when we're engaging clients and other stakeholders in therapy to share what it was like for them with these measurement processes, we're seeing that MBC may improve client engagement, as well as the working alliance or therapeutic relationship, and especially that client-clinician communication. And it makes sense because the better the relationship and the experience is in care, hopefully someone is going to then want to stick with treatment and then be able to meet their goals. They're going to receive a higher dosage, so to speak, of that treatment plan and process. So there's actually a recent meta-analysis that came out from one of our favorite scholars, Kim DeYoung and colleagues, that found that folks are 20% less likely to drop out of treatment when using MBC. And this is huge, you know, when you consider that showing up to therapy is half the battle. And we see in child populations anyway, the modal number of treatment sessions is 1. So we really do have a big issue in keeping people coming back to care, making it very, very relevant for what they're looking to achieve. So we're hoping that MBC is one of the, pieces that you can put into your clinical toolbox, really partner with clients in a way that makes treatment relevant for them and can improve their experience of therapy, the therapeutic alliance, and get them to kind of keep coming back and reducing that dropout.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. It is definitely something we see in the data of Greenspace, which is just the more assessments that a client fills out, the higher the therapeutic alliance tends to be, literally almost to a T, like a step ladder. And so it makes sense. I mean, from my common sense point of view, the more engagement that you have, the more aligned that you are, the more curious discussions, if you will, you have that look into the data, the better you're likely to get along in care with your clinician and understand them and feel heard and that sort of thing. So makes sense to me. We have a lot of clinical leaders watching the panel today and throughout the last 2 panels. In fact, the majority of people in attendance have been in clinical leadership roles. And then we know that 70% of those that have attended have said they're thinking about implementing in the next 12 months. And so we have touched on implementation throughout, but wanted to go back to it because it's a question that was submitted as part of the attendee submissions prior to the panel. And I'm hoping, Amber, you might be able to speak to some of the most key pieces of measurement-based care implementation for leaders to keep in mind when they're thinking about how to introduce it to their clinicians or at their clinic or whatever organization they're at. It's also a question that I see has come up in the chat already, as well as in the Q&A. So hoping you can give us some advice and thoughts on measurement-based care implementation overall.
Of course, absolutely. That's a great question. Well, there are a number of keys in terms of clinical implementation to support that, and they're on a big giant key ring jangling down the hallway. I'm going to give you one key that really stands out to me from my perspective and in my direct experience. The buy-in and commitment of clinicians and providers is critical, period. When people providing care can see and experience the value of MBC as not only complementing, but enhancing the strong care that they already provide, implementation, in my experience, has fared better because we can resolve a lot of the barriers, figuring out what to measure, clinician burden, which somebody just dipped into in terms of the Q&A, smoothing out the clinical workflow, leveraging technology to really assist us in collecting the data, getting the results, providing education to our clinicians. But if we don't have buy-in from our care providers, we've essentially done a really great job of providing tools for a process that ultimately people won't use. And at the end of the day, we need clinicians to use measurement-based care. They open the door for then the patient to benefit and engage in that bidirectional process. And so I think that interventions, we use them as clinicians when we believe in them. So when we have the willingness of clinicians and providers to really come to the table and engage in the practice because they understand it and they believe in it, and they believe in what it offers, then we're off to a really good start.
Yeah, and I would love to jump in on that too, because I completely agree and can't underscore enough what Amber is saying about the clinician willingness and interest to do MBC is crucial. And we're seeing that coming out of the Q&A, right? Like there's a lot of questions already around this topic. And I'll just add that we know there's a theory called the theory of planned behavior, that your attitudes about a practice, how you perceive norms in your setting, and how much control you have over the practice all influence your intentions to actually use something new, right? So there's a lot of new things that you might be onboarding in your settings, and maybe MBC is just one of them. But thinking about how we can influence practice, perceived norms, and personal control really help us get kind of a broader picture of encouraging clinicians to uptake something new. And as Amber was saying, like that's just one key on the key ring, right? Is the clinician viewpoint of this, because implementation is always such a multi-level effort, and the solutions or the strategies that an organization puts into place can be at the system or organizational level, can also be at the leadership level, as well as at that clinician level or the client and consumer level. So I always encourage organizations to really start with understanding, like, what are your unique barriers and facilitators that are coming up for you in your setting, and then fit your implementation plan accordingly. Because we can't give you a key ring and you take that same set of keys on the road with you to implement MBC everywhere. It's always shifting a little bit depending on your context. And there's so many different implementation strategies ultimately that we can use, and we're still learning about what's going to be working best for MBC in these different settings. So I encourage folks to really localize their approach to your specific context, keeping the clinician perspective, of course, front and center, but really thinking about those other kind of multi-level aspects that are happening.
Thanks, Amber and Elizabeth. I think, Jessica, I believe you brought up in closing remarks of one of the earlier panels, the comment of like, just get started. And I think like both the Amber and Elizabeth's response a little bit to me drives into that just get started notion of measurement-based care across a larger clinic or even a smaller clinic where your clinicians may not be ready, or there's lots of different pieces for you to keep in mind, can be super intimidating. And I think on a lot of the times with the organizations that we work with, it's not, hey, let's do measurement-based care and let's throw it across our entire organization. A lot of the time it is a slow process to start with an area. So it's one program within the clinic where you have clinicians that are excited, that can get on board, you can show its worth and show the value that it provides. Apologies. And then you can work on expanding around. That is often what happens with us in measurement-based care implementation is organizations start on the smaller end, see how it works, learn the kinks for their specific organization, learn and apply those learnings, and then move on. Moving on, most of the questions that we've taken on throughout all three of these panels have been very focused on client-reported assessments. One of the questions we received prior to this panel was around clinician-based assessments. And so I'm going to throw this to Sandy in hopes that you can comment on measurement-based care strategies and impact for clinician-based assessments.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a great question. It's one we get a lot. So the Collect Share Act model of measurement-based care that we use is really about using patient-reported outcomes. And that's a value-based decision. Unfortunately, the research doesn't necessarily support that yet. It's more about getting the client's voice in the room in a very specific way. It's about making sure that clients have an opportunity to independently provide information about how they're doing where in a way that feels comfortable to them, and allowing people to complete measures, for example, in a waiting room, or if you have an asynchronous solution at home, allows perhaps some honesty to come in, and some empowerment that somebody really wants to know how I feel without this being filtered through the clinician. That said, I love clinician administered measures. I, used to use them all the time. And there are some places in measurement-based care right now where we don't necessarily have good, valid symptom measures that we can do by self-report. Elizabeth's already alluded to this, for example, in psychotic disorders. So there may be times when a clinician administered measure, for example, if you're working with someone with schizophrenia, either prescribing medication or maybe you're doing CBT for psychosis, you may want to be tracking how those symptoms are changing over time because that's the target of your treatment. And so you may want to do a clinician administered assessment. But if it were me, I would add a patient-reported outcome measure as part of the measurement-based care protocol. So you're not replacing, you're supplementing. And a recovery measure, one we really are liking quite a lot these days, is the recovering quality of life, the ReQual. That's one example, but I'm sure there are plenty of others. And this way you get a much broader picture of how someone is doing and progressing, and you're still able to include that client voice in the room when you're doing measurement-based care.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandy. I think that was the only time we've covered the clinician side of assessment. So I'm glad we got to it. And we have a pretty good amount of time to cover some of the questions that have come through in the Q&A. Feel free to still submit them if you have any, or if you put one in the chat that hasn't made it over to the Q&A. But I will start with the first one that has the most upvotes. And that's 10 submitted anonymously. And we've covered this a little bit, but I'll throw it out there for the group to see if we have anything else to add. How do we implement something like this when our admin staff and clinicians are already overburdened? They often push back on new things like this. And I think this is also something we've been hearing a lot more since COVID began, and the conversation of just overburdened and burnout has been higher.
So I'll start, and then maybe somebody else wants to jump in, because I think we all have perspectives on this one. One of the things that we really emphasize is doing implementation planning in advance in a way that involves the entire team, so that everyone feels like they have input into the implementation. And I think the more you get everybody's voice included as you're thinking about implementation planning, the more successful you're going to be. Another strategy that we really talk about a lot is the benefit. And I know Jessica talks really well about this, both as an educator and from her own perspective, so I won't steal her thunder if she wants to jump in, but it makes your treatment better. And so having the message that we're not doing this because it's a checkbox or because, the agency says so, but that we really care about our clients and we really know that this makes treatment better. And, we've had providers who are transformed by seeing changes over time on graphs and saying, wow, this makes me feel good. Look at what I'm doing. And that sort of the light that comes into providers' eyes when they're really seeing it in black and white. So I don't know, pass it off to somebody.
Jessica, I'd also love to just hear your thoughts on this as an MBC practitioner too. And
Elizabeth, you cut out just a little bit. Can you repeat that?
I was just voting you on the island to share your perspectives as both a clinician that does MBC and also someone that supports large scale implementation. You just have such a rich clinician lens.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I think everything that has been said so far on this topic, I agree with entirely. I think that when it comes to the clinician, we've said it a million times today, and I will say it again, helping clinicians to understand why it's valuable, giving them tools so that they know how to do collect, share, act, so they feel confident. And I think that when we talk about making implementation something where we start small and then grow it, It's okay for clinicians to do that too. So if they're really new to this, there's nothing wrong with them just setting the goal of, with one person I meet with today, or one person each day this week, I'm going to do a measure with one, and I'm going to see what that's like. And I'm going to look at what my experience was like. I'll reflect on it a little bit. I'll come back tomorrow and I'll try it again. So this idea of we experiment and practice something in small steps as clinicians, we don't have to like be experts and do it with every client we meet with from the very beginning. We can even start with something like, let me just see what it's like doing this particular measure and get used to that one. And then I can fold in another measure if we're going to be doing that more tailored approach to measurement-based care. I think that once we start doing it and we recognize how it's helpful, and we see the way that clients respond, when clients say, I love looking at the graph, or I had one client tell me about 2 weeks ago, I'm almost ready to circle zeros for some of them. I'm almost ready. I wasn't quite there yet today, but there are a couple where I'm going to start circling zeros soon. I want to give the measure again. There's no way I'm not going to give her the measure again. So when it comes to clinicians, I think starting small there too. And when it comes to the support staff, again, we've said it here, pilot some of these different workflows and be prepared to make changes. I was meeting with the team just yesterday where they had one idea of how they were going to do it. They're finding that there are some roadblocks. It's labor intensive. So they're going to switch around the timing. So be prepared to talk about that. And if it does seem like it's just not quite working, there are probably other ways to get that done. I absolutely second involving everybody together. And I actually have recently experienced a situation where support staff were trying to take on more of the burden and not including the clinicians enough. And actually, it really does have to be a shared plan because it's a clinical process that involves a lot of people to make it happen. So I think that that could also be something that people might run into. I'd not experienced that before, where one group was like, we really want to support the clinicians, so we're going to do as much as we can. It was like, no, I think you actually need to engage them more, because there has to be a shared workflow here where you're communicating. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about implementation, but I think once you do it and you actually experience some of those benefits, it's so hard to say no.
I have to just say one thing here, and I don't want to belabor this point, but I'm imagining that there are some folks on the call who are like, this sounds great. I am in a joint commission accredited organization, and we are implementing measurement-based care, and we have a joint commission site visit. We're in the window, and so we're going to have to get this done, even though our clinicians are overburdened. So we have to kind of keep it real with folks. I think in addition to what's already been described, which I cannot underscore is fundamental, just providing clinicians and providers with that evidence of the value and really tapping into value. I think we also have to, as clinical leaders, administrators, meet clinicians with resources, because overburden can be feeling like, okay, this is another thing that's being intruded into my session space. And so that's a value-based kind of treatment versus I'm overburdened. I have a million pieces of paperwork I already need to do. What strategically are the resources that we can leverage within the system to really smooth out clinical workflow and process and make it make sense for people to actually get this done? Because often they'll come alongside if they have the resources to get it done.
Thank you, everyone, for jumping in there. In our experience, no two implementations are the same. How clinicians view measurement-based care, the type of clients people are working with, the system people are using, all change how they implement measurement-based care. And in some cases, you're going to have it where the clinician actually doesn't have to do anything except for jump into a client dashboard prior to a session so that they know what they're looking at and can be curious with them and address it with them. In other cases, the clinicians are the ones applying every single assessment and choosing what goes out. Two very different opposite ends of the scope ways of approaching things. It's going to work differently for everyone. I think what's important, and what I'm taking out of what you're all saying, is that flexibility is important, including clinicians in that discussion around how they would like to do it. But it's not necessarily of will we do it or not, but what is the best way to do it to support you and support clients. So thank you for that. I'm going to jump into the second question here in regards to upvoting. And I think this is really just asking, I'll read it out, but for an activity like the PHQ-9 activity that we had done last week, but do any of the panelists use the ORS and or the SRS measures regularly? And if so, do you have any recommendations or tips for counselors in using these measures with clients, similar to what you previously did for the PHQ-9?
I use those measures in some of my studies, so I'm happy to kind of jump in. And a couple things come to mind. I mean, first of all, I would recommend accessing the materials that the developer has. So Barry Duncan and his team actually have an incredible amount of videos and demonstration videos and so forth on the Better Outcomes Now site. So if folks haven't tapped in to those resources specifically about the ORS and the SRS, I encourage them to start there. And I think that kind of goes across the board. For any measure you're using, reach out to those measure developers, because often they have training that is specific to their measures. And as Amber was saying earlier, with some of these measures that have clinical cutoffs or, things that you should be looking at that are measure specific, they can provide some guidance around how do you provide that feedback. I just was actually saying earlier this week in supervision with somebody that I oversee, is like, you don't really want to give a measure unless you know everything about how to score it or be able to score it in the moment and provide some real-time feedback. So it's a good question, because you do want to do a little bit of advanced homework to make sure that if you're giving a measure, you can give that feedback. And the other thing that I'll say is this kind of segues a little bit into John Crocker's Q&A around functional and adaptive behaviors. So I don't think that the ORS is necessarily meeting all of what I'm reading from that question you might want, John, but with something like the ORS that offers 4 areas of general life functioning, the goal is to actually fit in the client's goals or kind of more specific treatment targets into those more global functioning areas. So that is a measurement system that could be used if you're interested in moving away from symptom-specific checklist into kind of more adaptive functioning or global functioning areas.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. One question I missed that I can see has 14 likes or upvotes is, what would you say to a clinician who is hesitant about implementing measurement-based care because they're worried it may be used as a performance evaluation tool? And this is a question we get very often, so I'm not surprised it has the amount of upvotes.
Well, I'm assuming that if you're the one answering that question, that you're also the one who can make decisions about how the data can be used, right? So if you are the administrator asking that question, then I think the first thing you got to do is ask yourself, how am I planning on using this data? And should I be using this data to assess performance? And the answer hopefully is no, at least not in an official performance assessment kind of way, so that aggregate client scores or improvement in treatment should not be how data is used to assess performance. Now, I think it's fully fair game if you have a mature implementation with clear guidelines and you've worked through all of your kinks and all of that, to use perhaps the percentage of clients who get assessments as a performance standard, or so that you're looking at whether or not they're actually doing measurement-based care. Ideally, if you're doing supervision, you're also looking at documentation and you're checking to make sure that not just collect is happening, but that share and act are happening, and that the data is really being integrated into treatment, that clients are having a say into their treatment, and all of the things that we talk about that empower clients. And I think that also is fair game. But as a supervisor or as an administrator, those parameters need to be really clearly communicated. And again, I would say that I would do that only in mature implementations, because you don't want to penalize people who are learning and exploring and as you get your implementation up. So I think we talk about creating safe spaces where measures and scores can be used to improve care, where where providers can feel comfortable bringing their data to the supervisor and saying, I don't know what's going on here. Look, the scores aren't getting any better. I don't know what to do. Can we brainstorm some ideas together? That's how you want to be able to use these kinds of data, I think, in terms of organization and support.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sandy. And I'm going to just jump straight into one last question to hope that we have enough time for it. But how does measurement-based care work with IDD populations?
Well, I'm stumped. they stumped me. I don't know. Anyone else on the panel have experience with this?
The only thing that I can say is somewhat similar. Actually, we got a question. We got the same question on a presentation that we did not long ago in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And this doesn't answer the question regarding IDD populations with adults. But in my work in schools, I have clinicians who are implementing measurement-based care with children, adolescents with developmental disabilities, including those on the autism spectrum. And so some of the things that we've discovered are particularly important for that population is making sure that, of course, you're using measures that are easily understood by the person that's receiving it. And maybe you need to make some adjustments to the language of the measure or the administration and how the measure is being administered. You probably need to return to the rationale and explaining what the measures are used for, perhaps a little bit more routinely than you might with other more typically developing populations. And you also want to make sure that if you have an opportunity for multiple raters or multiple respondents that have different perspectives on the client's functioning, that you're able to engage those folks that are kind of part of the ecology of the client, the identified client. So in child work, it's a little easier. I say, make sure you definitely have parent report, right? We always want that with children, but especially with our children that have developmental disabilities and learning differences. So those are just a few rules of thumb. I'm not sure how much that, necessarily generalizes to adult populations, but I think some of those may be relevant.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm going to throw it to Jessica and just ask, we've been through 3 panels, an incredible discussion. Any final words on behalf of the Yale Collaborative to leave attendees with that you'd like them to take home with them?
Yeah, I can't believe we've been through 3 panels already. It's been so much fun. I would just say that, when I think to like why we're all here to begin with, I think it's safe to say we're all here because we want to help people. We want the clients we work with to feel better and to grow and to thrive. And measurement-based care just helps us do that better. If someone's not improving, we can catch that and we can make those adjustments in a timely way. If someone is improving, we can see it and we can all feel way more confident in the work that we're doing. And that feels amazing as a clinician when someone tells me I'm improving and we see it and we have that evidence. And I think the best part about measurement-based care is that it doesn't matter what theoretical orientation we were trained under or what our discipline is, we can all do measurement-based care.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. This series has been amazing. It's been a pleasure doing this with all 4 of you and an honor to do it with you, and incredible to see the momentum of 1,200 people registering to learn about measurement-based care. So I think Greenspace is extremely excited about what that says about its future implementation, as I think you all are as well. There's a ton of educational content that has come out of this, and I just want people to know that, one, it's available at greenspacehealth.com. You can also go to the Yale measurement-based care site and see a lot of training videos on measurement-based care overall. We're also going to be taking all of the content that we've developed over the last little while and creating a bit of a hub where you can learn based on Q&As, videos, activities, that sort of thing. So we'll send that and share that with everyone once it's available. And stay tuned for other educational events that are coming up. The next one likely to be on the BRWAI, or Brief Revised Working Alliance Inventory, which is one of the most used assessments on Greenspace. And otherwise, huge thank you to Yale for this entire series and for your expertise and for what you do every day. And for those that are in attendance, taking the time out of your day today or multiple days, if you've been at multiple sessions, thank you for your interest in measurement-based care, for your interest in improving outcomes, and for the work that you do every day to help people in need of support thrive. So have an amazing rest of your week. Thank you, and see you soon.